When I am personally looking for a new electrolyte, there are a couple features that I am looking for. One of them is a really nice balance of sodium, potassium, and magnesium. And the other is I want to make sure there's no citric acid or other flavorings that not only are questionable for health necessarily, and I'm not saying that citric acid is questionable for health, but there are some flavorings that are, but I'm looking to make sure that those flavorings are healthy, they are safe for me, and that they won't cause any kind of histamine flares or other symptoms with clients that I have. Historically, I've had to recommend unflavored electrolytes to clients for this reason until now. Our sponsor for today's episode is Paleo Valley, and I am really excited about this partnership, not only because I've used their library of products with clients for a long time and personally, but because their electrolytes, specifically the ones I've been using, their watermelon electrolytes, do not have any of those unnatural flavors, citric acid, things that would cause symptoms in clients. And they also have a gorgeous ratio of sodium, potassium, and magnesium in their electrolyte powder. For that reason, I am so excited to bring them into this episode on hydration electrolytes because I've gotten amazing results with their electrolyte powders with my clients, and they also taste amazing. And the watermelon ones are pink. So that adds just a whole other layer of fun when it comes to hydration. And I notice for myself, if I do not have my water in a pretty cup with a nice flavor, I'm much less likely to drink enough water throughout the day with the amount of minerals that I need. If you want to try Paleo Valley's products or their electrolytes, you can do so at a discount and use the code paleovalley.com/QTD, and the link is below. So, Amanda, I was looking up the difference between the word mistress and maiden because I was trying to figure out if you're the mistress of minerals or the maiden of minerals. And I think mistress is actually like a well-regarded term, like an authority figure. So I think you're the mistress of minerals. I think that's what I'm calling you from now on.
Maybe. I feel like maiden because like you, I guess mistress of minerals. Yeah, because it's like, I just think of like when you become a mom, you go from maiden to mother. That's what I think of that.
You know what? Hold on a second. You're the mother of minerals, Amanda. What like are we doing here? You're the mother of minerals. So I couldn't have an episode on hydration and minerals without the mother of minerals. It wasn't going to happen. Of course not. So welcome back to the show. One of my best friends, one of my favorite human beings, the smartest dietitian in the world, Amanda Montalvo. Yay. I'm so happy you're here.
Thank you for having me. I'm like, am I the smartest or are you the smartest?
Let me answer that quick. You. Maybe Jillian? Maybe
Jillian's the smartest.
Kind of Jillian, actually. Forget both of us. Jillian's the smartest dietitian we know. Exactly. Yes. Amanda, you do really in-depth work with minerals. And in this episode, I really want to lay the groundwork and basics of minerals because, as you can imagine, a lot of what we talk about on this podcast, and you know, is the societal context within all of the nutritional learning we have. And now it's really all about adrenal cocktails. I consider you one of the pioneers of that. It's all about how we're not hydrated. But I think people still don't understand on a cellular level and a biological level what hydration really is and how important minerals are. So I think today I really just want to cover with you and you'll help me to uncover a lot of the myths and truths about hydration and minerals.
Yes, I'm excited. There are a lot of myths out there and ones that I think it's still kind of difficult to know, like, is this true or not? Like, you'll see a lot of people share that information. And like we were talking about before we hit record, it's just such an underutilized tool. Like, I just did a newsletter about this. I think it was last week on hydration.
It was literally this Sunday, by the way. I was dying laughing because I was like, oh, perfect prep for
we're
the episode.
Gonna talk about this. Yeah, it's one of those things I think people are like, oh no, I'm good. And I'm like, are you though? Like, because there are little tweaks that you can make when it comes to your hydration that can make you feel really, really good.
Do you think that a majority of people are actually dehydrated and don't realize it?
I do. I think most people are. Yeah. For the most part, or like overhydrated and under mineralized. I see that a lot. Like the trend of those giant water bottle jugs that are like, I think they're like a gallon of water. Have you seen those online?
Yes, it's like it's the next Stanley Cup thing. It's those like, it's literally like 16 cups. It's literally a gallon of water.
Yeah, it's like a gallon of water, and people be like, fill their thing. And I think it's very important to hydrate. We're going to talk about that, but not adding any minerals to that. And then they're like talking about how they're like constantly peeing. I'm like, guys, this is a red flag. This is your body trying to tell you something. So, it's important.
So this really, you already kind of poked at a couple of the important topics. So you can be overhydrated from a water perspective, but under mineralized. Tell us a little bit about that.
So when you're drinking water that doesn't have any minerals added to it, and this could be like your water out of your faucet, it doesn't have, a lot of people think of like, well, I'm not drinking reverse osmosis water, which removes all minerals, right. And literally everything. It's a great way to filter water, but it removes everything. And a lot of reverse osmosis filters now add them back in because we know how important they are. But even just like your typical water out of your faucet, unless you're on well water, some well water is amazing, but oftentimes it's not going to have adequate minerals in it. It's just water. And so in order to actually absorb that water into our cells, we need sodium and potassium specifically. That really helps it actually get into the cells and be used for like the dozens of different functions we use it for in the body. So you can drink a lot of water, but not adding minerals to it can lead to you're just peeing that out. And that's also pretty stressful on the body. And that's like one of my signs, like things that we ask our clients, like how often are you urinating throughout the day? And when they are doing that excessively, it's a big red flag.
Absolutely. And so I think this, from doctors, we've learned forever this number, 8 glasses of water per day, 8 to 10 cups of water per day. What do you think about that as a baseline recommendation?
I don't think it's terrible. I like to meet people where they are. I just think it's so important to do that. Obviously, you're listening to a podcast. We don't know you. We can't like tell you how much to drink. So what a cool way for you to kind of discover is to track what you're currently drinking. This is what we have clients do too. We're not like blindly like just add in more water. We want to know how much are you currently drinking? Are you adding minerals? Are you doing adrenal cocktails, coffee, tea, all that kind of stuff? And then from there, we get an idea of, okay, this is how much this person's drinking during the day. And we'll compare that to, are they urinating all the time? Are they sleeping okay? What's their hunger, their appetite like, their skin? I mean, literally all your symptoms, we could talk about POTS, MCAS, like that hydration is so important for this population, really for every population, but like something we really hone in on. And so we would want to compare what they're currently doing and then slowly optimize it. Because if you just automatically, like say you track what you're drinking and you're like, okay, minus coffee and tea, which we'll probably talk about, I'm getting about 50 ounces a day. Obviously, that's probably going to be low for most people, especially if you're not adding minerals to that. So you wouldn't just want to go to like, okay, well, I'm going to go to 80 ounces. That's going to stress your body out, and you'd want to slowly increase your water intake. Otherwise, again, you're just going to be peeing all that water out, not really hydrating yourself, and potentially losing more minerals in your urine.
If you jumped from 50 ounces to 80 ounces drastically, and you're saying that would stress your body out, can you tell us how overhydrating on just the water aspect without the minerals is stressful to the body?
Yeah, so it's going to be a lot more work for your kidneys, which can also impact your adrenal function and impact your sodium status. So how much sodium are you retaining? Are you getting rid of? And literally when we are low in sodium, it is a stressor on the body. Our body recognizes this as, okay, I'm moving into fight or flight because we don't have adequate sodium, because it's so important. It helps us get nutrients inside our cells, hormones inside our cells. Like low sodium diets we've seen lead to insulin resistance for a lot of people. So sodium is incredibly important. So when we start to really overhydrate without adding minerals, we can actually be depleting our mineral levels, and that kicks off a stress response in the body because we use those minerals for so many different functions.
Sodium is a very interesting mineral to talk about because it also has been quite villainized. Of course, as we think of salt, table salt in the cases of high blood pressure. When we think of sodium from a visual perspective inside the body, can you walk us through what it does to, like you said, enhance absorption of water? Tell us a little bit about sodium and what its role is in the body. And if you can provide visuals, that would be awesome.
Yeah. So when it comes to sodium, and we can't talk about sodium without potassium because they work hand in hand.
Yep.
Sodium, like what doesn't it do in the body? It helps us transfer nutrients, it helps us transfer hormones. It's important for keeping our blood volume and just overall water volume in the body at a specific amount that keeps us stable, keeps our blood pressure up. It's also really important for absorbing the water that we're drinking. When it comes to like actually taking that water inside our cells, well, even in our small intestine, honestly, we need sodium to be present. So if we really want to absorb that, take it into the system and then get it inside our cells, we need to have enough sodium and we need to have enough potassium. And that helps move water inside the cell. It also helps move things outside of the cell. So if we don't have enough of that, then that sodium potassium pump isn't going to work properly. And that will lead to cellular dehydration, which often I think of fatigue when I think of cellular dehydration. That's the most common thing I can think of is like people, I'm drinking a lot of water, but I feel like I'm just peeing it all out. While they can have kind of other common signs of like your typical dehydration, maybe like dry skin, maybe I think of like headaches, dizziness, things like that, constipation, dry lips and mouth, and that's like pretty obvious. But even flushed skin, I think of like dehydration when I think of flushed skin, not being able to tolerate hot or cold. And when I think about, okay, if those things are showing up and this person's also really fatigued, but they're drinking a lot of water, they're likely not getting that water actually inside their cells.
If you aren't getting the water inside your cells, where's the water hanging out and what symptoms could there be outside of just feeling like you're peeing it out? Where does the water go if it's not absorbed into your cells?
Well, it could just be sitting in that extracellular fluid as well. And you could end up with like edema, like fluid retention. That's a common one that we see. And just like bloating is common, but even just like over your whole entire body, it's a lot of people will say like, I feel inflamed, and it's like a little swollen, things like that. You can definitely have that swelling. You can have that even if you're getting in enough sodium, I do want to say, because we need potassium to balance out the sodium. And this is where people are like, oh my gosh, this is so confusing. It's not. I promise you, it's not confusing. You just want to pair them together. And if it's not together at that very moment, throughout your whole day, right? Like that's all you want to think about. Potassium-rich foods is the way I think about it. And then sea salt, salting your foods, or if you're adding salt to your water. Like it doesn't have to be any more complex than that. And the amount you do, you're just going to experiment to figure out what you feel best with. But I do see a lot of swelling when people increase their sodium intake and then they don't increase potassium. And that's because that potassium helps to balance out that sodium. So if you get swelling, you add sodium into your diet. If you increase your potassium-rich foods, that will help give you like a little bit of a diuretic effect and then work with that swelling.
Totally. And then structurally, tell us about the sodium potassium pump. Is it literally like what you would picture as being a pump that is pulling water in and out of the cell? Tell us about the sodium potassium pump.
Yes. So that pump, it'll pull water in and out of the cell. It'll pull hormones in and out of the cell, nutrients from our food. It's literally how we transfer things. And that's another reason why sodium is so important, but potassium is too. Like if we don't have adequate potassium, it's hard. It's also hard to get hormones inside the cell. I always think of thyroid hormone when I think of potassium. Potassium also helps sensitize our cells to. The other aspect of the sodium potassium pump that I think is important to just like know about, especially if we're thinking minerals, is that it does require energy to run. So it needs ATP, our body's main fuel source. And what helps us make that, obviously like the food that we're eating, but minerals also are really important, like calcium, magnesium, copper. There are a lot of minerals that are really important even just for that process. So not only do minerals help hydrate us, they help us make energy to even get that hydration process going.
Tell me also about the relationship between sodium and how we maintain fluid balance in the body. So it's not only that sodium obviously like absorbs water molecules, and if they're in the wrong place, you kind of like get that again swollen kind of feeling, but sodium's also responsible in some signaling and communication between the body to let you know, hold on to this much water, release this much water. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so that's going to be a lot of specific hormones like in our kidneys. So the more like sodium that you're getting in, then typically the more that your body's going to want to get rid of. So it's not going to be retaining as much water because you're going to have this hormone release that's going to tell your kidneys, hey, we are going to either retain this sodium because we need it, or we're going to get rid of it because we have plenty. And along with that, we'll be getting rid of water as well. And that's kind of where potassium is important too, because potassium helps to balance out that process where if you don't have enough potassium, then you can just end up retaining a lot of sodium. Once you add that potassium in, it has like that effect where it balances it out. They oppose each other. A lot of minerals work synergistically and antagonistically, and that's really the relationship between sodium and potassium. It's like they work together, but they also oppose each other to keep everything in balance, including that fluid in the body.
Absolutely. And then tell me, are there other mineral duos that are worth mentioning? Ones that work either synergistically or antagonistically?
Yeah, I think of calcium, magnesium. Those are very calming minerals. We need them for many different things. They're both really important for bone health. They're both really important for blood sugar, and they work together. But if you have like, say, for example, you're taking a magnesium supplement and you're already depleted in calcium, or you're taking a lot, like I see people taking really high doses of magnesium.
Like over 1,000 milligrams.
Yeah.
I see all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, okay, that's going to deplete your calcium, especially because a lot of times these are people that are like, I can't tolerate dairy. Not that that's the only way that we get calcium. You can get it in like cooked greens, beans, seafood. But, a lot of us are getting a decent amount of our calcium from dairy. So say you're like, can't consume dairy, you're not as having as many calcium rich foods, you're taking a lot of magnesium, that could deplete your calcium stores. And that can have a huge impact on your nervous system, your stress response, histamine symptoms, things like that. So those work hand in hand. Same thing with if you're taking an excessive amount of calcium, then that can deplete your magnesium. They go together for sure, but they also are important to have, like, to consume together just so that you get all the benefits.
Absolutely. And I also, I'm aware of the other duos, and there's a couple other we'll talk about too. I want to go back to sodium because I'm going to torture you with more sodium questions. So sodium specifically, even in traditional dietetic school, right? We're always learning that if you have low sodium in your blood labs, it's probably related to something more like an edema, like you have fluid retention, less than the actual sodium that you intake. Same thing if your sodium's high in your labs, it's usually related to functional dehydration, or like not even subclinical dehydration, but like actual dehydration.
Yeah.
What do you see when you're looking at sodium in blood versus sodium in on an actual hair mineral test?
So first of all, if someone has low sodium in their blood, I would say, please start consuming some sodium.
And actually, you're saying it is still a sign that they need sodium.
Yeah. Like if it's low, it takes a long time for our blood measurements to get out of balance typically, because our blood our body very tightly regulates the blood values. So it's going to compensate and take nutrients from different parts of the body to keep them within a specific range, because your body wants to keep you safe and alive. So whenever blood is out of range, I'm like, this has probably been going on for a long time. When it comes to hair testing, that's when you can typically see a change before you'd see it in your blood work, which is one of the reasons that I really like it. So say, for example, someone has like really low sodium on their blood test, and on your hair test, it could either be really high, meaning you're using it up, you're in an active stress response, this is why people are like, hair testing isn't accurate. I'm like, it is. You just have to, the person reading it. Yeah, you have to read it correctly. But oftentimes, if I see low sodium on a blood test or potassium, it's going to be really low on their hair test. But before it would have seen that on the blood, we would have seen it very high on the hair test and been thinking, okay, you're actively stressed. That's often a sign of that. It's also usually a sign of inflammation, and like what stage of stress you're in. And that's when you can take action, right? Oh, I'm using up a lot of these minerals. I'm going to add some more in so that you don't get to the point where you're like chronically depleted on a blood test.
If we were living like cavewomen, would we need to be adding mineral supplements to food? Do we have a mineral crisis of sorts where our food supply is depleted in minerals? Are we just so much more stressed that we need to add electrolytes to food? Are we not drinking? Well, we can't like drink seawater, obviously, but like
Do not advocate for that.
yeah, like please don't. Why is it that we need minerals externally, especially when it comes to hydration? And would that have been true, do you think, historically through human time too?
No, if you look back, it like we were taking in even more sodium. I mean, like thousands and thousands of milligrams a day. Like if I think it was,
Wow, is that true?
yeah, we used to take in a lot of sodium. And in the book, The Mineral Fix by Dr. James D, it's a great book about minerals. If anyone wants to nerd out, get a lot of studies.
He talks the author of The Salt Fix.
Yeah, the salt fix. Yeah, another great one if you're wanting to learn about hydration and stuff. But basically, he's talking about how we would have had a lot of salt to like preserve food, and we also would have gotten it in other forms. So we would have had a ton of salt, but also a lot of potassium naturally. Because if you think of like people think potassium's just in carbohydrate rich foods. It's not. It's very rich in animal foods as well. And so I think the ratio ended up being like a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2 ratio of sodium to potassium previously, which is, I mean, now a lot of scholars say that it should be closer to like a 1-to-4 ratio. So 4 times the amount of potassium to sodium, or like 3 times the amount of potassium to sodium. And again, that's definitely going to depend on the person and their health history. Like if someone has low blood pressure, definitely not going to be that high in potassium, right? Like you would have a lot more salt to improve that. But he kind of goes through and saying like, one, we just got a lot more in general. I mean, like thousands and thousands of milligrams of each, and the ratio would have been much different. And there's multiple kind of different ways to look at that in studies that he goes into. But I was like, that's really interesting because I wouldn't necessarily have thought that. You know, you would think that, oh, isn't
everyone's
sodium
eating
higher
preserved
now?
meats because there's no
way to,
there's no refrigerator,
to
so you had to preserve the meat. That's fascinating. And we're not saying whether health at a certain time was better or worse. I'm just talking about through human history, because it does really appear to me that we do need to add salt to food, and we do need to add electrolytes for us to be what we would consider optimally hydrated, or really to avoid even, again, clinical levels of dehydration.
Yeah. And I do think that there's a very big difference between like processed foods that have a lot of sodium versus like someone that's like salting their food. Cause I get this kind of pushback online a lot of like, well, the majority of Americans are having way too much sodium because of the foods that they're eating. And I'm like, okay, but I'm not advocating for people to eat those foods. I'm advocating for people to eat whole nutritious foods that they are primarily cooking at home or getting from a good source. So in that case, we absolutely need to add salt to our food because otherwise if it's like a fresh food, you're really not getting a ton.
There's really not naturally occurring sodium in many of the foods that we consume. I would assume outside, even like if you're eating something like seaweed, I'm like something that's in the water or fish, there's not a tremendous amount of sodium. It really would be in the curing process, the smoking process, the preservation process that you add salt to preserve.
Dairy has a little bit, but yeah, it's like I think of like pickled foods, like, you know, fermented veggies. I think of like olives, like canned sardines, you know, like preserved healthier foods, things like that. It's if you're eating primarily fresh foods, you do definitely need to add it. The amount is just going to depend on who you are and your health history. And if someone listens to this, because I mean, I'm like, obviously we're very interested in health and wellness and understanding and supporting our bodies. If you do decide to add salt in, go so slow. Go so slow. Because we don't want you to get
how will you know
retention.
if you went too fast, Amanda? It's more the fluid retention you're talking about?
Fluid retention. Like I don't know if you've seen this. We've seen this in a few of our clients lately. People having histamine reactions to salt.
Interesting. I mean, also, is the salt coming from something that the electrolytes also, if it's electrolytes, does it have citric acid in it or something too?
No,
that could
just
be
salt. Like just salt. Just plain sea salt. The only thing that didn't cause it for someone was table salt. Because I was like, we got to experiment. Because at this point, we tried so many different types of sea salt. They all flared. But then
And what were
table salt.
now I'm just interested. What were the actual reactions? Were they site specific flares? What was
Yeah,
it?
it was like a redness around the mouth and like cuts in the corners of the mouth, which I often see with immune stuff for people, and like with especially the history of like viral load and stuff. But yeah, it was that, or like some people have, like if you people make Soleil, I love Soleil. It's basically when you're just adding a ton of salt to water and letting it completely saturate that water. I like it because it's easy to add to your water and it like mixes in, versus like you add sea salt and it's kind of like all at the bottom and then you're drinking the end and you're like, I'm drinking the ocean. So Soleil doesn't do that, which is nice. And you can like titrate it better because like if you think about a teaspoon of salt has like 2,300 milligrams of sodium.
Yes.
A teaspoon of Soleil water is going to have, I think it's around like 450 milligrams. So it's easier to like slowly add sodium to your diet that way. But it's really easy to make. But some people, even having small amounts of that, I think they're just very depleted in sodium. And so their body's like,
so your body gets a little bit, and then the processes it needs to do, it has enough nutrition to do them. And it almost maybe kicks off a little detox reaction or something like that.
And because they have the history of, having a more sensitive body and like with the immune reactions, I think that they're just more sensitive to even
I haven't seen that, but I believe every single one of your clients' experiences, because I think a lot of my MCAS clients and a lot of people listening are also POTS clients, which I'm sure yours are too, obviously.
But not the ones that reacted.
That's what I'm saying. This is a fascinating conversation, Amanda, because for the POTS, I don't, for those listening, the recommendation for this syndrome, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, is 10 grams of salt per day. For context, if you have hypertension, high blood pressure, the recommendation is 1,500 milligrams. So it's 10 times what the recommendation would be. I find that people who have the dizziness, have the lightheadedness, they do so incredibly well with sodium. I'm curious if someone just has MCAS but doesn't have POTS, if they would react differently. So this is just something for people to kind of think about while they're listening too.
And if you have, and I mention it because if you have a weird reaction and you have the histamine history, maybe you have a history of gut issues or something, and that happens to you, like, don't freak out. We just had to like, doing the Soleil really helped. Going a lot slower really helped. I just couldn't believe. I was like, wow, that is like and
it's real. That's the experience they're having. And you're trialing each item. So you know exactly what's causing what reaction. That's real science. You're watching this happen in real time with your clients. That is extremely interesting. And when it comes to sodium also, and I hope they're better now, obviously.
Yeah, they are. We figured it out. It was just something I saw it like 3 times in a month. And I was like, what is happening?
Very interesting. So let's talk about these electrolyte mixes when it comes to sodium also. So I find with my clients who have POTS, they do really well with Element, which is LMNT. That one, they do fantastic with it. Though, like you're saying, if we want that ratio of potassium to sodium to be 4-1, Element has a reverse ratio almost. It has more than a reverse ratio. It has a 5-1 sodium to potassium ratio. So how would someone know if they're like an Element electrolyte person or a Paleo Valley electrolyte person? I think a lot more people do better if they don't have POTS with something like a Paleo Valley, which has a really nice, who's our sponsor for this episode, who has a really nice mineral ratio. Tell us about that. What do you think?
Yeah. So the Element is much higher sodium than potassium. I think there's only like 400 milligrams of potassium or around there.
It might be 200.
Even less. Yeah. It's like much, you're not taking it for the potassium, right? If you have POTS and you need to be consuming a lot more sodium, it's helpful. If you're very low carb or keto, I think it's very helpful. If you do intermittent fasting, I think it's also helpful. So I think for that population,
why, if you're low carb, it's important to have sodium.
Because you're going to use up a lot more sodium. Typically, if you've been doing low carb or keto for a really long time and your body is like very well adjusted, you may not need that much more sodium than potassium. It really depends. But in general, like if I'm going to generalize, I would say most of the time you're going to need a lot more sodium because like typically getting rid of a lot of those minerals. And then if someone has like insulin resistance, I would say they typically do better with a lot more sodium.
A lot more sodium, actually.
Yeah, because of the way that sodium helps get nutrients across the cell. And if you are someone like when it comes to the more potassium rich ones, we didn't even mention pickleball. That's like pickleball, Ravy, Bumble
pickleball
root.
is having its moment. Tell us about pickleball.
So pickleball or something like Ravy or Bumble root powders. Those are like the coconut water, dehydrated coconut water powders. They're very high in potassium. They're mostly just potassium. They have a little bit of magnesium and I don't think like very teeny tiny amount of sodium and a little bit of vitamin C. So they're great if you want a potassium source. I find that typically if someone like if they eat more carbohydrates, if they're like extremely active, if they have really low potassium levels, like maybe you've done a hair test and you see that, if you're hypothyroid, things like breastfeeding, pregnant, things like that, it can be really helpful to have more potassium. I still like to add salt to it though. I don't want just straight that much potassium. It's too much. So I still tell people to add like a 1/4 teaspoon of sea salt, which is still going to give you, it basically ends up being like a 2-to-1 ratio of potassium.
I was going to say, I don't think you like a 4-to-1 ratio, even though like, I don't think in practice you like that, to be honest with you.
I just don't actually, I've seen it. I've only really seen a few people need it. The people, like I would say most people that we work with, it's closer to like a 3-to-1 or a 2-to-1 ratio. And oftentimes depending on if they have the history with POTS, 1-to-1, you know, so, or even like, you know, the other way around. So, it just really depends on the person, but it's also like, I think it's so important to get enough sodium in and you can only eat so much potassium, you know? So it's like,
and
if
tell
someone's
us potassium rich foods too, Amanda.
Yeah. So potassium rich foods, I mean, any animal food is going to have it. So like meat is a great source, chicken, seafood, beef, pork, all great sources. And then if we think of more of like the plant sources, things like greens, any like veggie, I recommend cooking it because you want to be able to absorb the potassium. So like cooked greens, cooked beans, potatoes, squash, fruit has it. It's so much higher in other things though. Like people are like, oh, I'm eating like fruit for my potassium. I'm like, it's not that high. Like people think banana, I'm like, not that high. White potatoes, extremely high in potassium. Winter squash, very high in potassium. But even like salmon, super high in potassium. So it's like, it doesn't have to be one or the other. I like a mix of plant and animal foods for getting minerals. But you can, and then typically dairy is a great source too. But it's like, yes, it's in a lot of foods. It's easy to get a lot. But if someone's, you know, maybe they track and they end up consuming around like 3,000 milligrams of sodium and they feel good with that, I don't think they need to eat 12,000 milligrams of potassium, you know, like that's insane. So
how much is in a potato? How much potassium is in one potato?
I think if you do like a cup of potatoes, it ends up being like 600 milligrams. Coconut water.
600. You're talking about 12. You're talking about 12,000.
Yeah. It's like, and there's amounts in like pretty much everything you're eating. So like it does add up.
Accumulate. Right. Yeah.
But I would say if you're being conscious of it, it's without supplements, just getting it through food, 5,000 milligrams. It's, you know, it's doable, but you have to be very intentional with it. Yeah. So it's like, I don't know. I think it's something where you just have to like see what you do best with. And I'm like, I hate when people stress over little details like that probably won't make or break their health, you know, and if anything, like they're going to prevent them from seeing success. So I think that ratio has been like a little bit overblown. And it's like, you got to keep it in context to yourself, depending on your health history and what you're currently eating too is a big deal.
When I think of potassium, I'm more thinking about the capacity to lower blood pressure. And when I'm thinking about sodium, I think of the capacity to increase blood pressure. Is there a mechanism you can explain for that briefly for people?
Yeah. When it comes to potassium, it's leading to that dilation of the blood vessels. It like will drop your heart rate quick. That's why with the potassium powders, I'm like, don't do it. Don't do it if you have POTS or the history of low blood pressure. Even if you see low potassium on a test result, I would still be very conscious of that and talk about it with your provider. And with the sodium, it's basically having the other where it's constricting. And so it's going to make sure that you're pumping that blood. It's going to improve that blood volume. When it comes to potassium, it's going to drop it. So they're both important. We just want to make sure that we have a balance of them and that we're having the right amount for us. Interesting thing too, with those, like something like pickleball specifically, even bumble probably. I don't know because it's slightly different because it's coming from coconut. Like all the potassium's coming from the coconut water. But I had a few people in my Master Minerals course. They're like, man, my blood pressure like dropped with pickleball, even though they added a ton of salt to it. And I was like, that's interesting. They didn't do a full serving. They added a ton of salt. And then I was trying to figure out, because pickleball uses stevia and monk fruit as well. And stevia can cause low blood pressure. Did you know that?
Oh, I didn't know that at all. That's fascinating.
So
I wonder the mechanism behind
stevia. And so I'll let you know. But there's like studies that show it lowers blood pressure, and you have to be like really careful.
That's extremely interesting. Yeah.
It is an herb.
Everything we've always learned about heart health is lower your blood pressure, enhance vasodilation. And as we know, in our client populations, low blood pressure and a resultant high heart rate after your blood pressure or your heart rate goes too low is almost more common in a lot of our clients, honestly. So them focusing on only prioritizing potassium when it comes to hydration, only prioritizing potassium when it comes to their overall health is something I get very symptomatic when I have too much potassium and not enough sodium. I do much better. We've joked about this because Amanda knows I'm like a fish. Like I could probably drink seawater. Just kidding. It's dangerous. Don't do that. Yeah, exactly. It is so much better for me. This is a question I have for you too. If people are ramping up their sodium intake and they're actually trying to do their potassium at the same time, and they do notice a little bit of fluid retention, is this something where you'd say you got to keep going and you'll hit a point where the water will come off? Is this something where you just say it's just too much for you? How would you have people kind of think about that?
I think it depends on like when the fluid retention started for them. Like if it was immediate, then I would be very tempted to say back off and start over, because it's probably only going to get worse as you keep going. If you're like, hey, I was consuming this many milligrams and I felt really good, and then all of a sudden I just started to notice retention, there's a few things I think of. I'm like, where are you in your cycle? Because that's really important if you're a woman, because during that luteal phase, you're much more likely to have fluid retention. And I have seen this happen with clients where they were increasing it and they're like, oh no, all of a sudden I'm like, I have a ton of fluid or I feel really bloated. Feels like fluid retention. I'm inflamed. And then we look at their chart and I'm like, it's probably not just the salt. So let's stay where you're at right now. That's probably what I would tell most people. If you didn't start that way, try to be consistent with what you're taking, but don't go up anymore. And you could just try adding a little more potassium in. So maybe it is, and maybe you're already eating a lot of potassium rich foods, but you're like, okay, I'm going to add in like a little bit of pickleball or the bumbleroot powder or just coconut water. You could just drink coconut water too. Aloe vera juice, inner leaf, that version is very rich in potassium. And it's also really nice just for, gut health, inflammation, if you've got reflux, all those kinds of things. So I love aloe. I think it's like a really nice herb to use for many things, but potassium too. So that's like usually a quick one where I'm like, okay, why don't we add a little bit of that in, stay where you're at, and see if that changes
things. What form is that in? Are you taking it in a juice? It's liquid.
Yeah, just like a juice. Yeah. That's the one I typically, because that's where it's going to have the most potassium. I think it's like a cup has like 800 milligrams. Or something like that.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's similar to coconut
12,000 before. I'm like, if I had three, it's just it's impossible to strike that ratio. No one can strike that ratio.
No one can. And like I get it. Like maybe a research article said that it's optimal, but I'm like, that's not real life, and that's why it's like I share it because I'm like, this is the information.
I need 12 cups of aloe vera juice. I mean, come on. I'm not getting there. I have to eat like 10 potatoes. I mean, that it's not going to work.
Well, because that's the other thing you have to keep in mind. Like minerals are important, but you also have to keep in mind like okay, what is also important? Like a balance of protein to carbs, So
Totally.
trying to make sure, okay, I need more potassium, but maybe you're dealing with a little bit of insulin resistance. And then you would say, okay, I'm going to try to get more animal foods that are rich in potassium and not overdo the carbs just because I'm trying to get potassium. And the other thing is like our bodies are not calculators. It is so important to remember that. And you have to go based on your lived experience of how your body's responding to things. I like minimum effective dose personally with myself, with everyone we work with, because if you do really well, we've had so many clients that have like, they increase sodium and potassium. It's not even by that much. Maybe they just get an extra like 2,000 milligrams of potassium a day. So they're not even close to 4,000 milligrams, but they're like, my bowel movements are better. My energy is better. I'm not having headaches, like that sort of thing. It's like, okay, then don't obsess over the 5,000, doesn't have to be like this perfection. Same thing with the sodium. Like for our POTS clients, 10 grams can feel very daunting.
And it could not feel good too. You really would have to build up to that, to just pound your body with 10 grams to start off with. I don't have any POTS clients who even go up to that, to be honest with you. We usually we can stop along the way. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, I think, and a lot of people, I'm like, they're like, do I have to track exactly? I'm like, no, because you're tracking the symptoms. Yeah,
exactly. It's much more important, the symptoms, than hitting that actual number. And like, that would be, again, for context, that would be like 10 element packets. It's most people are like freaking out drinking one of them because they're super salty. When it comes to kidney disease, again, heart disease, it's worth mentioning that, again, because our kidneys and the hormones related to our kidneys will affect our fluid balance. Mm-hmm. Once you're in a state of kidney disease, it is often recommended to drop down on both potassium and sodium and phosphorus, just because it requires kidney function to utilize and process these minerals. So it's just worth mentioning that it varies so much from person to person, these recommendations. I think that the ultimate recommendation, which was everyone should have 2,300 milligrams of sodium, I think we're starting to just question that maybe more as time goes on. However, if you have specific conditions, again, if you have POTS, if you have a kidney condition, if you have high blood pressure, maybe, I don't know, maybe your sodium recommendations are different, but that's a bigger conversation. And again, if you do have POTS, your potassium recommendations might be different. So I think it does take self-experimentation and keeping these things in mind when we're adding electrolytes and minerals in. Another important thing you mentioned, Amanda, was that if we're eating all of our potassium and we're trying to get our potassium from food and we're getting some from meat, we're getting some from potatoes, but we want to kick it into high gear with like aloe vera juice or something like that, you do have to be mindful of the fact that, again, it affects the rest of the nutrients you're getting from the food and the macronutrients. So that's why I think electrolytes and mineral powders are so helpful, because they're really good hacks, because you don't need to have the rest of the food in order to get your mineral status up.
Yeah. And it's nice. That's why it can be nice, like when they're a combination, it's not just one sole mineral. And if people always ask me, like, what's the best one out there? I'm like, it really depends on what you need in the person. And if you're not sure, I do think the one from Paleo Valley is pretty neutral, right? It's got a nice mix of sodium, potassium. They're not quite 1-to-1. It's probably more like a 2-to-1 ratio of sodium to potassium. But it's all from food. They have a little bit of calcium, a little bit of magnesium. The watermelon one.
Yeah, I just drank it literally before this call. I should have it in my hand. It's incredible. And there's no citric acid, which is really helpful for people with MCAS too, because a lot of the electrolyte powders do have citric acid and they're not that well tolerated.
Yeah, for sure.
Exactly.
So it's like, I feel like that's a good neutral one. A lot of people ask me about, oh my gosh, like so many different brands that I look them up and they just don't have that many minerals at all in general. And I'm like, this is not necessarily bad, but it could help you absorb some of that fluid that you're drinking, but it's not going to like fix the deficiency. So that's another thing to keep in mind. It's like, how much do you need? Are you actually deficient? Are you just looking for maintenance? And then, even just this time of year, we're recording this in the summer. It's really hot where I am. The amount I sweat is like ridiculous. And then I'm nursing right now on top of it, it's like I need a lot of fluid. But that means I also need a lot of minerals to like replenish as well. So it's like, just always keep it in context to you. And although like we can purchase them and just, you can buy any supplement, doesn't mean that it's going to go great. You just want to always be mindful of what you're taking. They are powerful. That's for sure.
I'm going to give an anecdote about how Amanda walks the walk. We were once in a, what do you want to call it, Amanda? A stressful social situation,
Call it that.
where we met for the first time and fell in love, obviously. But we were in a stressful social situation. I'll pin it there. And Amanda had a bag of bumble root, and I think you had half the bag. I'm not even kidding. Like we weren't sweating. We were indoors, but your stress signal, you went throughout the 3 days. We did go on you and Jillian went on secret hikes to talk about how distressed we were, where you also did carry the minerals with you, but you were crushing, Amanda. I actually think you did 10 servings that day, to be honest with you.
I might have overdone it. And I was adding salt to the bumble root, don't worry. And I'm all like, does anyone want any? This was also years ago before anyone even knew about it. Everyone's like, what are you drinking? I'm like, don't worry.
And it was a bunch of functional dietitians. And we were like, we're actually good, Amanda. It looks like you need it yourself, I mean, anytime I've seen you in person, you do have minerals with you. You do walk the walk.
I'm literally 100%. Drinking some right now. I just feel like I do drink plain water. I do. It's just like, generally, I feel so much better and I feel more hydrated. An interesting thing, I don't know if you want to talk about this, but have you heard people discuss breastfeeding thirst and breastfeeding hunger and how you get so thirsty, so hungry? Yes. I think that these are actually dysfunctional signs. I don't think it's normal. It's very normalized. You're breastfeeding, you're going to be thirsty 24/7. I think that just means that those people were probably already dehydrated before they started nursing, and they're probably dehydrated on a cellular level, right? They really need those electrolytes. We use up a lot of electrolytes and minerals in general during pregnancy. We lose 10% of our minerals during pregnancy. And then you use even more after because you're producing breast milk if you're nursing, and then you are more stressed and you often have broken sleep. So you have so many mineral resources you're using up. So if you we don't have any studies that show that potassium or electrolytes significantly increase breast milk supply. But I'm I've seen it in myself. I've seen it in clients where when they do consume them regularly, they have way better supply. They're not thirsty all the time.
I mean, it's literally a fluid composite coming out of you. So of course you're going to need the minerals for it.
And no one's researching breastfeeding,
That's going to be the last thing that people are researching.
Yeah.
And it should be the first thing that people are researching. So are there any studies that show in times of stress, in times of pregnancy, in times of breastfeeding, that our levels of minerals in the body are lower? Do we have those studies? Do we have hair
we
mineral
have
tests?
The studies to show how much we lose, about 10% overall, during pregnancy. And then we know that our nutrient needs are higher postpartum. Even if you don't breastfeed after, your nutrient needs are still higher because you're recovering and there's so much to rehabilitate in the body. You made an organ and then, got rid of it. So we definitely have higher nutrient requirements. But yeah, that is a very normalized thing that I see all the time. Oh, I'm just constantly, I'll get my water, I'm breastfeeding. And I'm okay, but please put minerals in it. Please. The Paleo Valley ones would be great, or a bumble root with some sea salt would be great. You definitely want potassium if you're nursing. And I do my clients that even if they are nursing and they have the history of MCAS spots, they still take in way more sodium than potassium, but it's I call them mineral bombs. It's an element packet with coconut water. It's just a mineral bomb.
Go all out.
Yeah, but it makes a big difference.
So we know we lose minerals. Is there any storage of these minerals that we can tap into, or you need to replenish them on a daily basis?
It depends on the mineral. We definitely store minerals. The only one we don't really store a lot of is zinc, interestingly. So I would say for minerals that you want to get daily for sure, definitely sodium and potassium. We can tap into stores, but it's you're not going to be absorbing as much water you're drinking. You're definitely typically going to feel more fatigued. And that can lead to a lot of other unwanted headaches, things like that. But zinc is actually one that I've come across in my research. I'm like, man, we don't really store a lot of zinc. Like we store iron in the liver. We store a lot of minerals.
And we kind of wish we didn't store a lot
I
of
know,
extra
we
iron in
kind
the
of wish
liver.
we didn't. It's also, we kind of wish we didn't. And like the spleen, right? So it's like something where, we do store a lot of minerals, we can tap into that, but zinc, you really don't. And that's why it's when you get blood work done or a hair test done for zinc, it'll constantly be fluctuating and changing whether you're supplementing or not, because we use it up. Like say you have like some big inflammatory reaction in your body or an injury or something, then your body's going to take that zinc, bring it to wherever it needs it. But we just store very, very little of it. So I would say zinc is an important one.
I'm scared of people overdoing zinc supplementation. And now, by the way, people are taking potassium, which is I'm like, don't recreationally take potassium capsules or something like that.
Yeah.
There's almost no circumstances with which I recommend people just take potassium. They have to test first. They absolutely have to test first.
Yeah.
What are your concerns with zinc overload and just taking zinc for your quote unquote immune system all year? Since COVID, I have clients who are coming in and they're taking like 70 milligrams of zinc a day for years on end.
I know.
What are your concerns with that? I know.
Okay. So the one big concern I have with that is our iron status, right? And because these are the same people that are like, my ferritin is 1, my iron's really low. My iron saturation is like 7%. And that's because zinc works with copper. They can be synergistic, but they are also antagonistic.
Yes.
And so if you're taking a lot of zinc, it's going to reduce how much copper you have available. And then that copper is what helps make iron available. So this is why you would never want to take a zinc supplement with an iron supplement. You always want them to be separate. And ideally we
that
get
would be
zinc
very
from
silly
food.
to do that, by the way.
A lot of people do a lot because they don't know. And I don't blame anyone because it's like, again, whenever you're taking a supplement, I want someone to know exactly why they're taking it, how long they're going to take it for, how are they going to know when they don't need it? Is it going to be maybe a test? Maybe it's a symptom. Maybe it's a specific timeline based on a protocol you're doing. But we should have an end time for pretty much all supplements. I don't think it's bad to take zinc. I don't. But like you mentioned, like so many people are just taking it because they're like, oh, I was recommended this dose when I had COVID. And it's like, great for the short term, not great for the long term. And then another thing, and I talk about this inside Highly Sensitive Body Hub. I got the name right. So proud of myself. Guys, I say it wrong every time. I talk about how like a lot of people will have low iron and that can lead to histamine flares and MCAS flares as well. And we're kind of like, okay, so this low iron is coming from inflammation for sure, or a virus because the body's going to sequester that iron and hide it. But it can also, I think a lot of it is also because that population is also very heavily supplementing with things like zinc. And then when they add in something like lactoferrin, which increases iron absorption in the gut, they like in our intestinal cells, they feel so much better and they stop having flares. So we have to be very careful with zinc supplementation. It's not that we're never going to do it. It's just you want the time and place. You want to know how much. I don't like using more than like 20 milligrams a day with people. And I like to also think about, how long does it take to restore the zinc levels? We're never really going to know what they are overall. Because if you do a blood test and you happen to like be really inflamed that day, your zinc's going to be low. If you do a hair test and say like clients that have long history of gut issues, MCAS, things like that, the zinc's off the charts because their body's using it like crazy, as long as they're not supplementing. But, usually people coming to me know better with zinc. So
that always concerns me with people with MCAS. So people with MCAS tend to take zinc because they also tend to be people who are hypermobile. And we think of zinc regarding like collagen creation. We think of zinc regarding
copper is important for collagen creation. Copper works with vitamin
I hear you,
C.
sister. Yes, exactly. So people come in often taking zinc supplements for a long period of time because doctors who are treating them or practitioners who are treating them for hypermobility will give them zinc. And then I have these huge iron concerns, huge copper concerns. And I think that people, again, who are taking zinc, I just see them being more flary.
Yeah.
in the long term. So I'm always concerned about zinc. There's very few people, Amanda, that I would recommend zinc supplements to without you personally analyzing a hair mineral test and blood labs. And my clients know, like always with their consent, that if it's a mineral question, I'm always like double checking and, you know, bringing it to you. But zinc is something that I'm always hyper cautious of for those reasons as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So in ways of electrolytes versus minerals, which minerals are electrolytes?
So sodium and potassium are our electrolytes. And then we have macro minerals. These are the minerals that we need in larger amounts. And then we have our micro or trace minerals. These are minerals that we need in much smaller amounts. And like electrolytes they also categorize as macro minerals, but the electrolytes specifically, those are the ones that are dealing with the fluid balance in the body.
Exactly. So I think, again, people are hearing the word minerals and electrolytes all over the place. Not every macro mineral is an electrolyte. Not all of them are related to fluid balance specifically.
Yeah.
So when you're hearing electrolytes, you're going to be hearing about micro minerals, and you're going to be hearing about sodium and potassium, essentially, which regulate fluid in the body.
Yeah.
So your recommendation, I'm assuming, would be for most people to kind of start to have some level of consciousness around their minerals. Maybe, do you think everyone at some point in life is going to need some added minerals through an electrolyte or a mineral powder composite?
I think it depends, because there's like different types of people that we see, right? So there are people that are like, I make the majority of my food. They eat a ton of potassium rich foods and they salt their food, or they like to add a little bit of sea salt to their water. Maybe they make Soleil water, something of that nature. Those people, I don't think they necessarily always need to have an electrolyte powder. Usually they'll drink like coconut water with sea salt once a day or a couple times a day, depending on the time of year, how much they're sweating, all that kind of stuff. And maybe they're just adding a sprinkle of sea salt to their water a few times a day. So that's kind of like one scenario. And then we have people that are like, I don't have as consistent of a mineral intake from my food. Maybe they want the convenience. Maybe they travel a lot. Maybe they're a mom. Maybe they're running a business and they don't have as much time and they want like that security of having a really high quality powder. I just love it. It is really easy and it makes it so that you can't really mess it up. Right. So, but I also get a ton of people that are like, how can I do this myself without that additional cost of a powder? And they're just not all created equal, that's for sure. And there's so many out there now. So that's when it's like, I think most people could benefit, but if you're someone that you want to do it all yourself, I think that's totally fine too.
And you can get there through food, obviously. But you really do kind of have to be conscious to stay hydrated, I think.
Yeah.
I also just I know we're talking about the minerals and the electrolytes when it comes to hydration. Amanda knows this about me, horrendous hydrator. It's a huge, I just don't have like I don't have a thirst. I don't have an appetite for fluids of any kind. I could go a very long time. I'm sure we could analyze this.
I was going to say
biologically. Exactly. But it's been my whole life. It's just, it's probably because I think I have a theory. I think it's because I had a history of acid reflux. So I don't like filling my stomach up. I will tell you also, historically, I don't have like an amazing appetite either. So when I drink a lot of fluids, then I just don't want to eat because I don't like to have my stomach full in both ways. I mean, you know my body so well, Amanda. I'm assuming that's what it is.
But I would agree. Yeah, I think especially with the appetite thing too. It's like, I'm like, what does Michelle run on? Like, how does she do it? I don't get it.
I run on love. I run on compassion. Other people's oh my God. I think it was Olivia who just said to me, she was like, what did you eat for breakfast? Like the world's problems or something? And I was like, yeah, that was my breakfast this morning. I always eat breakfast for anyone listening. Okay. But it is a very conscious effort for me to hydrate well. And because of that, I am always needing to add minerals to I have to make every ounce of water count, essentially. Yeah. I think what I like about all these powders also, to be honest with you, even though we could get into a discussion of it not being like unprocessed and we can get the most unprocessed versions, is that it also makes water taste better, which I think is awesome too. Like they all have a pleasant flavor, the ones that we're talking about. Even salt in water, I think is enjoyable to drink. Yeah,
I will say, especially having a 2-year-old now, I mean, like Eliana has always like, she will drink plain water, but like the days we're outside, it's really hot. She's like sweaty, her face is all red. Like she'll pound mineral drinks. Like she loves them.
And that's safe for kids, by the way. That's worth saying also.
But you definitely want the balance. A lot of people ask me like about sodium and potassium in kids. It's like, you just kind of think of yourself and it's like a quarter of that. Like 25% of what you would consume, probably safe for most kids. If they're really little, probably closer to like an eighth of what you would consume. And I just dilute her drinks a lot more. And if she's drinking mine, she naturally drinks less. Kids are so smart. Like their bodies are there, especially if they're very regulated, like they can make all those decisions. So I'm not like super crazy about hers. She has always had salt. There's a lot of controversy with salt in like babies, but their kidneys are fully developed by 6 months. So it's like, they need salt. We don't want to overdo it, but they absolutely still should be having some salt in their food. So kids need minerals too, but it really does encourage them to drink more. She likes the Paleo Valley powders a lot too.
And they're pink, like the watermelon one's pink. Like how much more fun can you get than like the pink powder with no citric acid in it? It's so fun.
I know.
So happy about that. And it really does taste very refreshing for summer. And also, do our hydration needs, this is a very simple question. Do our hydration needs change seasonally?
Yes. So if you're losing more water, you'll lose a lot in your sweat, like other minerals as well. Mostly sodium and potassium. You lose some magnesium, a little bit of calcium. Everything else is kind of like trace amounts. But the more you're sweating, the more I'm like, you need to replace those even more. And some people have I think people that are like, I have a hard time sweating, if they have like thyroid issues, then you are losing less minerals, and that would likely not be true for you. But for people that are, you do need to replace them a lot more. You'll notice a difference when you do or don't. You typically will get a lot more headachy. If you do have MCOS, you'll have a lot more flares when you're not hydrating with minerals, things like that. So that is very, very important. And then the times of the year that you're not sweating as much, it is a lot colder. It's like you can still hydrate yourself with other drinks. Like you can hydrate yourself with things like bone broth if you tolerate that. Teas are, especially like herbal teas, are very rich in minerals.
They count. That counts as a fluid.
Yeah.
And especially ones like oat, like if you get like a beautiful herb like oat straw that has a lot of micro minerals in it too.
Oh yeah. I mean, literally, like nettles is a great source of potassium, and that's a great one for histamines too. But I love that one for period pain too, and like blood clots and stuff. But so it's like teas are another one. So you can hydrate a little differently, but I'm definitely not as like aggressive at hydrating those times of the year because you're just not using as much. Ideally, we're sleeping more, hopefully if you're kind of like living with that circadian rhythm, and your body is just like in more of like a rested state.
Also, we had a client who said, when I started drinking nettle tea, my periods got longer and she was concerned about it. And I said, my first question was, well, what were her cycles before? Because her cycles before were like 23 days. And I was like, yes, they're getting longer because it's probably helping to regulate your hormones and cycle, actually, if anything. Like, so she was concerned about it. I was like, no, it's actually, it just goes to show you with any of these kind of questions that we have about our bodies, about anything that changes, we're nervous about. And sometimes the changes are awesome. So that's just something to think about too. All right. This was incredibly helpful. Is there anything we missed about hydration, Amanda, that you think is really important?
Maybe I just think a common question of like caffeine. Will caffeine dehydrate me? Like that sort of thing. I get that one a lot. So caffeine, whether it's like, I think of coffee or tea primarily. Soda's like, we're not really promoting drinking soda. So we'll just focus on coffee and tea. But those are primarily made up of water. And they do have caffeine, which can have a little diuretic effect. But it's not so much that it's going to cause like deep dehydration. If you are drinking coffee on an empty stomach, it can signal your stress hormones much higher than they would naturally be signaled. And that could lead to a lot more peeing, dehydration, things like that. But if you're, I always recommend having a caffeinated beverage after you eat breakfast, so that you're not having a stressful response in the body. But the net, like, dehydration is very small. And when you look at like how much you're actually losing, but some people do notice a big difference. And that's when I'm like, how are you drinking it? Like, when are you drinking it? How much are you consuming? Is that the first thing you're having for the day? Cause I like to have people have like a little sea salt and water when they first wake up. So I think it just depends on how you're using it, but it's not super dehydrating.
So there's a nugget there that I want to elaborate on too. So when you're stressed, your stress hormone cortisol will influence aldosterone and their relationship. Aldosterone will affect whether your body, again, maintains fluid or releases fluid. So stress can also really affect hydration status as well, and how much fluid you're retaining, because you can be really swollen from stress and still be dehydrated. And I think people are really scared to up their minerals and up their water when they're already swollen. But I really find, and there is this little, like, I don't know what's called, like a whoosh effect, where when you do strike the right amount of hydration at some point, the fluid actually comes off. And I really have noticed this. It's not like how weight loss people, weight loss experts, quote unquote, are like, when you heal your trauma, the fluid just comes off. Like, it's not, it's not like that. But quite literally, when you get your minerals at the right balance, I have seen it happen where clients just suddenly like feel that fluid come off a little bit too.
Yeah. And it also is like, it can be, if you're super stressed and you're really depleted, it can be a big shock to your body. And there is internal adjustment that has to occur. So I think too, it's like, we want everything to happen like immediately. I think it's so important to pay attention. Always pay attention to your symptoms. They are communicating with you. But if you say you have testing and you're working with someone, and this happens, share your concerns with them, and then know that it's likely just that you are so depleted and so stressed, and there's other changes you have to make and be consistent with, that it will even itself out. But if you're not working with someone, that's a hard one, because you don't know, is this right or is this wrong? So it's always nice to have that support.
Absolutely. I think the main messages or takeaways I want people to have is that naturally, many of us will be unknowingly dehydrated or unknowingly depleted in electrolytes, and that we can replenish them through food. A little bit hard for the electrolytes specifically. So there are different balances and types of electrolyte supplements we can take. We talked about in this episode also sodium versus potassium. Who would do better with that kind of ratio? What kind of ratio we're looking to strike? And also just being really mindful, again, that your hydration needs go up during times of breastfeeding, during pregnancy, during summer, during any time that you're losing water or you're really stressed, your hydration and mineral needs are going to move up and go up.
I love it.
I love it. I love you. And thank you so much.
I love you.
Amanda, where can people find you? I'm joking, because like everyone, I feel like if you know one of us, you know both of us at this point. Where can people find you, Amanda Montalvo? How do they find you, the mother of minerals?
The mother of minerals. I need to change that on my website. So you can find me on Instagram at Hormone Healing RD. If you like to listen to podcasts, which I'm assuming you do, if you're here, you can listen to the Are You Menstrual podcast anywhere podcasts are found, or watch on YouTube. And then my website is hormonehealingrd.com.
And you can, I'm going back for a second. I'm like, are we doing mother mineral? Because that's another option, by the way. I'm just like, I'm not settled until I feel really good about that. Feels good inside of me. I'll tell you that. Yeah. Mother mineral. Amanda is also in the HSB Hub talking about minerals too. Yeah. So if you are a member, please don't miss Amanda's videos. They are beyond incredible. Like every single thing she does. I love you. I'll see you, I'm sure, next season or very, very soon. And thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.